Hey y'all, Coach in the Fight here, talking about the Holy Day Calendar. And in this video, I plan to produce a Holy Day Calendar for the current year and all of the years to come. Many people have been asking about the feast days and they want to know when these feast days occur, and they often want you to project them into the future. Now, that does make sense to me because I too believe that there's coming a day when we won't have that Gregorian calendar, that man made calendar on the wall, that humanity goes by these days to know when our birthdays are and work days are, and when it is we're supposed to go to school and church. I believe that when we have the fall of Babylon and the fall of Egypt, they're going to take that calendar with them, and nobody's going to be producing that calendar after the apocalypse. So the plan is that we can understand when these holy days fall by way of a table that we'll produce in this video, and then you can write those dates down in your Bible or in some other place that you can refer back to those days from year to year as we go forward. Now, I hope you caught the idea that I said that we're going to be producing a calendar. There's actually some information that has been provided for us from a website called infoplease.com. It's talking about the Jewish holidays from the year 2010 to the year 2030. What should jump out in your mind is that this is a Jewish calendar, not a Jew calendar or a Judean calendar or a U calendar if you want to try to pronounce it more properly. This is a Jewish calendar. And although they will have many of the dates correct, there are some errors in this calendar, as we're going to see by way of this video. But instead of just giving you the final results, I'm going to show you what changes are going to be made to correct this calendar. And I'm going to use scripture in order to do so that you can follow along and be assured that the final calendar will be more accurate than the Jewish calendar. Okay? So, first of all, let's create us a table. We're going to copy this information directly from this website, and we're going to put it over here in our Open Office Calc program. Now, first we notice all of the days that are listed here. They have Purim, which is the post-exilic festival that you hear about and read about in the book of Esther. You have Passover, Shavuot, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, which you read about in Leviticus chapter 23. You also have Shemini Ashteret, which is also listed in Leviticus 23, and you have Hanukkah, which you read about in the book of Maccabees. We will be adding some holidays to this schedule, and others we will be changing the dates of this schedule. But like we said, we're going to show you biblical proof before we do so. Just to show you what I mean, we're going to start off with the most important change that we will make on this calendar, and that's around the time when you see Passover. Now, when we click on Passover from the website infoplease.com, which claims to be an encyclopedia on the Judaism religion, we see that it says in regards to Passover, in Judaism, is one of the most important and elaborate of religious festivals. Its celebration begins on the evening of the 14th of Nisan. Now, that right there is going to be one of our areas of contention. Notice that it says that Passover starts on the evening of the 14th. Then it goes on to say, and lasts for 7 days. That's going to be another area that will need to be corrected. It's saying that Passover lasts for 7 days. Okay, now to make this correction, like I said, we want to have biblical proof to show you what it is that we're going to do in order to change this, we have to come over to the book of Leviticus and chapter 23. I will make a note here how in verse 1 and verse 2, how this is the Lord speaking to Moses. And he says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feasts of the Lord, which ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations. Even these are my feasts." Some of you will need to pay close attention to this verse because it's saying that these are the Lord's feasts, not the feasts of Moses. But anyway, let's go on and let's go down here and let's look at the fall feasts here, starting in verse 4. It says, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons." This is important to understand because the feast days have to fall in their seasons. We can't perform feast days in other periods of time, just like the pagan people wouldn't dare to change the days of their pagan festivals. In other words, nobody's going to be celebrating Christmas in July. They're all going to be celebrating it on the exact day, December the 25th. Well, that is the same way for the Lord's feast. They have to fall on the exact day. In verse 5, we see in the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. So here we are talking about the Lord's Passover, which is the first change that we're going to have to make to the calendar. But notice here how it says that this starts at even on the 14th. Now, we will pick on the year 2021 as I make this point. You see how it says that Passover begins on March the 27th of the year 2021. But then when we look back at our table, we see that it says that Passover begins on the 28th of March. Well, that's because the holy days start in the evening before. So in other words, the Passover that they're describing would consist of the daylight hours on March the 28th, but would have actually started the day before on the 27th. So now when we come back and we look at verse 5 out of chapter 23, we see that it is telling us that Passover should have started the evening before the 14th day of the month. Now, this should be made a little more clear when we come over and we look at a calendar that shows us the sacred months for the month of March 2021. You see how down here on the 27th, it's saying that it is Nisan the 14th. And down in the notes, it's saying that that is the eve of Passover, and that the 28th is day 1 of Passover, and that the 29th is day 2 of Passover. So that verifies what we saw on infoplease.com with one major exception, and that is how Leviticus 23 doesn't say that there is a second day of Passover. See how in verse 5 it's talking about the 4th day of the month is Passover. And then in verse 6, it's talking about the 15th day of the same month, but it's calling it the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But when we're looking back at our calendar, there is no Feast of Unleavened Bread listed there at all. So what InfoPlease and Google and the rest of the websites are pointing to when they're talking about Passover is not what we read in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 5. They're actually talking about the Feast of Unleavened Bread. See how it says that it lasts for 7 days? When you look back at Leviticus 23, you see that unleavened bread is a feast of the Lord that lasts for 7 days. So what they're doing is they're skipping the actual day of Passover, and calling the week-long feast of unleavened bread Passover. So when you look at your calendar, you're not seeing the Passover at all, unless you have some special calendar that lists both unleavened bread and Passover. The calendar that you're looking at that is claiming to be Passover is actually talking about the week-long feast of unleavened bread. But now that I am editing this video and looking over it for the last time, I see that this calendar from timeanddate.com is actually pointing to the actual date of Passover. You see how down here it says Passover day 1 is on the 28th? And of course, that date would actually start on the evening before. But look right there where it says Passover Eve. That's actually talking about the true date of Passover. When we click on it over here, we see that they didn't try to offer us much information about this day, Passover Eve, even going as far as to say it's not a public holiday and that most businesses follow regular opening hours on that day. So obviously, to the Jewish community, Passover is not an important day at all. But for spiritual Israel, it is an extremely important day because we recognize it as the date of our future coming marriage supper and the communion feast. We can see a clear distinction between what they call Passover Eve and what they call Passover Day when we click on this link. You see, as far as for Passover Day, it's saying that it starts on the 15th day of Nisan and it lasts for 7 days. Of course, this day would fall on the Sabbath day, so there's no surprise that it is a day off for the general population, with schools and businesses being closed. So we have to give credit to timeanddate.com for at least putting it on the calendar, even though it seems like they tried to make it as insignificant as they could. So our first change that we have to make to the calendar is to add the feast of Passover and to change what's listed as Passover to unleavened bread. So you see what I've done here as far as this calendar is concerned, the corrected calendar. I changed the name of what they had from Passover to unleavened bread, and I've added another column for Passover. And now I'm going to simply do a calculation using this program to subtract 1 day from what's listed. And as I'm doing so, I notice that every one of these years is saying 2021. So I'm going to have to come in and actually correct that to give us the correct year for each one of these dates. Well, looking back over at infoplease.com on the table that they provided, we see that the year wasn't provided at all. So the program that we are using, Open Office Calc, actually took it upon itself to add the year into each one of these dates. But that's okay. We can actually correct it by going in and formatting our cells. Like I said, I want you to know what I'm doing here. So for one, you can have confidence in what you're actually looking at. And for two, if I make a mistake, you can help me to correct it going forward so that we can have an accurate calendar. But I'm simply going to format the cell in order to prevent it from giving me the year. All I want it to show me is the month and the day. And I'm looking at this for the first time, and I see that it's actually offering to give me the lunar months or the sacred months. So I will definitely be using that in the future. But right now, I'm just going to have it give me the month and the day. So now we have both Passover and unleavened bread listed. But I'm going to put down here in the bottom that note that all feast days begin the evening before. So as far as the year 2021 is concerned, we understand that Passover begins on the evening of March the 26th and goes through the daylight hours of March the 27th. and unleavened bread on March the 28th. Now, to get a New Testament illustration of that, you will remember the story of when our Messiah was crucified, how he had the Last Supper on the evening before the 14th day of the month, and he was betrayed by Judas in the nighttime after the Passover. And it was during the daylight hours of the 14th, or the daylight hours of the Passover, in which he was crucified. And if you remember the story, they had to get him off of the cross before the sun went down because it was beginning the Sabbath day. Well, that Sabbath day that they were talking about was the Feast of Unleavened Bread that was starting on the 15th day of that month. So let's come back over to Leviticus 23 and see what it is next we need to change on our table, changing it from a Jewish holy day schedule to the table used by spiritual Israel, or the real Israelites of today. So we look in here at the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Again, it starts in verse 6, where it says it starts on the 15th day of the month and it lasts for 7 days. In verse 7, we see that the first day is a holy convocation. And then down in verse 8, we see that the 7th day is also a holy convocation. But then down in verse 9, we see that we're actually starting another festival there. It says, "Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, when ye be come into the land which I give unto you, and ye shall reap the harvest thereof, ye shall bring a sheaf of the firstfruits of the harvest unto the priests." This is an offering that people should make to their spiritual leaders during that time of their firstfruits, so that they may do a wave offering. And when you look at verse 11, it's telling us when that is supposed to occur. It says, "And he shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you on the morrow after the Sabbath. The priest shall wave it." And of course, the 22nd day of Nisan is a Sabbath day. So what verse 11 is talking about when it says the morrow after the Sabbath day, the priest shall wave it, they will perform this wave offering on 23 Nisan, which will be March the 5th. So I'm going to add another table here. This is yet another day that wasn't included on the calendar. So I'm going to call it first fruits, since that's what's talked about in verse 10, is a sheaf of the first fruits being waved on that day after, or on the morrow after the Sabbath day. Again, the reason why I'm doing this like this, even showing you my errors and mistakes, so that people who are smarter than me can actually check my work. So look down in the comment section of this video, because anybody who comes in and tries to refute what I'm saying, there's going to be some back and forth conversation as we try to hash this out. And if I'm in fact in error in what I'm doing here, I'm going to change the final product of this table. One thing that I'm going to change already is my note down here at the bottom, where I got all feast days begin at the evening. I'm going to change it to state with an asterisk that this feast day starts at sunset the day before. And then I'm going to just add the asterisk beside the columns that this refers to. If what I've done so far makes sense and you are in agreement with it, please add that comment down below too, as there are many who are only going to look for the final results and are not going to verify this for themselves. But if they see where others have gone in and checked my work, they will have more confidence in the final results. Now, the next day that we need to focus our attention on is Shavuot. Now, out of all of what we've seen here, this one is probably the most problematic. I'm going to add a column here just to show you what I mean. If you come to this date here, which is first fruits, as we said in the year 2021, it's on April the 5th. But if you add 50 days to it, you end up on May the 25th instead of May the 17th. The error that the Jewish community has been making all of these many years is that they haven't started the 50-day count or the Omar count on the actual date of first fruits, which falls at the end of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they have started that 50-day count at the beginning of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, I have done many videos on this subject before, so I'm just going to hit some of the highlights of those videos in order to prove when the actual first day of the Omar count was supposed to take place. And the first place we'll look is over in the book of John in chapter 20, when it is talking about the resurrection of the Messiah. We see here in verse 1 of John in chapter 20 that Mary Magdalene went to the sepulchre on the first day of the week in order to tend to the body of the Messiah and found it empty. You see that it was on that same day that she actually saw the Messiah. This would have been the first day of the week. You see that in verse 14. She saw Jesus standing and knew not that it was Jesus. Looking back over at our calendar, we'll know that it was on the 14th day of the month that they crucified him. And then there was a Sabbath day on the 15th day of the month. So all of this would have taken place on the 16th day of Nisan. But you see right there in verse 17 that the Messiah told her not to touch him, for I am not yet ascended to the Father. But you see in verse 19 that it was that very same day, the first day that all of this took place, that the Messiah actually appeared unto them, being the 16th day of Nisan. But you see in verse 24 that Thomas was not present with them at all. But drop down to verse 26, you see that after 8 days, again, the disciples were within and Thomas with them. Then came Jesus, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, "Peace be unto you." That's when you see in verse 27 that the Messiah told Thomas to reach his finger into the holes that were still in his hand and in his side. To help us to understand this, we can use this little table that I created really quickly using the sacred calendar months. So on the 13th day of the first month is when they would have been preparing the Passover. As the sun went down, it would have changed to the 14th day of the month at evening. But it was during the daylight hours of the 14th day of the month that there was the crucifixion. And before the evening, which would have started the 15th day of the month, they had to take him down off of the cross and get him into the tomb. Mary Magdalene wouldn't have been able to go to the tomb on the 15th day of the month because it was a Sabbath day. But in the early morning hours on the 16th day of the month, the first day of the week, is when she went to the tomb and actually saw Jesus after he was resurrected. But then on the 16th day of the month is when they actually got to go to the sepulcher and they actually got to see the Messiah there in his resurrected body, but was told not to touch him at all. But then we read on in the story, we see that after 8 days had passed, the Messiah appeared to the rest of the disciples, including Thomas, who was told to put his fingers in the nail holes. Well, you see here that date would have fell on the 23rd of Nisan, which would have been the day after the Sabbath day. That's the day that's being talked about over here in Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 11, when it says, "The morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it." In other words, that appearance by the Messiah to the disciples was a wave offering. And then you see down in verse 15 that the day after that Sabbath day, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, you shall start counting the 50 days. So the Omar count would have started Nisan 24 and would actually end on the 14th day of Sivan, or the 14th day of the third month. Now, to be clear on this, we have to jump over to the Septuagint translation of the Bible because the wording there is a little bit different than the King James Version, and it is necessary to understand these wordings for it actually to make sense. You see in verse 15 of the King James Version where it says 7 Sabbaths complete, which meant that the 50 days should actually have landed on the 16th of Sivan instead of the 14th of Sivan. It also says in verse 16, it says, even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, there shall number 50 days, and ye shall offer a meat offering unto the Lord. Whereas it appears that the days don't calculate correctly in the King James Version of the Bible because that 50 days actually lands the day before the Sabbath instead of the day after the Sabbath. When you look at the Septuagint translation of Leviticus 23, you see that it is actually worded differently. Instead of saying 7 Sabbaths complete, it says 7 full weeks or 49 days. Verse 16 says, unto the morrow after the last week. Instead of saying after the Sabbath, it's saying after the last week. Again, pointing to the 49th day and the day after being the 50th day. So from that translation, we can see that the date of Pentecost is actually on Sivan 14, or the 14th day of the third month. And just like the 14th day of the first month, it is a day of sacrifice, where they're even sacrificing animals, which is forbidden on the Sabbath day. So what this means is that the date of Pentecost, that actual 50th day, is a day of preparation as they get prepared for the 15th day of the month. For secondary confirmation of this, we could jump over to the book of Jubilees and chapter 44. We see in verse 4 that Jacob is actually celebrating the festival of first fruits, or that day we call Pentecost, on the 14th day of the month. You see up there in verse 1 where it says that he was in the third month, and in the third month he went on his way to the well of the oath, and he offered a sacrifice to the God of his father Isaac on the 7th day of the month. But then you see in verse 3 that he remained another 7 days waiting for a vision from our Father. So 7 plus 7 is 14, taking us to the 14th day of the third month, when he celebrated the harvest festival of first fruits with old grain. So when we are calculating the day for the Feast of Weeks, it's 50 days after the Feast of First Fruits, which starts 7 days after the Passover. And it takes us to the middle of the third month. So now we can delete this column over here because it is completely incorrect. That is the Jewish date for the Feast of Shavuot. And it is actually about 7 days too early. Now, some of you would be wondering about the Christian day of Pentecost and when they celebrate Pentecost, because it in fact falls on a completely different day. Well, we're looking here at an excerpt from Wikipedia on Pentecost, and you see that it says that the day of Pentecost is 7 weeks after Easter Sunday. That is to say, the 50th day after Easter, exclusive of Easter Sunday. So whereas the Jewish community will be celebrating a week too early, the Christians have gone about to create their own day altogether based on Easter. That is what the scripture means when it says that they will change the times. They've changed the time of Pentecost, which is actually one of the 3 mandatory feasts listed in the Bible. I see no problems with the rest of the dates that they have for Rosh Hashanah, or the memorial of blowing of trumpets, the date of Yom Kippur, or the Day of Atonement, and the beginning of Sukkot, or the memorial of booths. I've actually been doing this for over 20 years as the Father put it on my heart to verify these dates, even when I first learned about Passover for some reason. In other words, every year I've been calculating these months and verifying that the Jewish community had them right. And the only times that they seemed to have got them wrong was during Passover, which I understand now that is because they was only counting unleavened bread and Pentecost, which I understand now they were starting with the wrong Omar count. But as far as the actual beginning of the months, they've actually been pretty accurate every year. So with that said, I'm not going to be making any changes to the fall festivals on this table. Okay, so the last thing we'll talk about is how the calendar actually repeats itself every 19 years. Like I said, we wanted this calendar to be a perpetual calendar lasting into the future. So to do that, we can just add 19 to each one of these years to see how it will project into the future. So what we saw in the year 2012 will be the same for the year 2031. So we can take out all of the years that have passed, or I will just hide them. Then we can go out a 19-year clip, which takes us to the year 2039. Then we can calculate the subsequent years. And so we have the years that these dates correspond to. So now let's clean this up a little bit. So to recap, let's discuss what it is that I had to change and why I had to actually change it. This has only made clear to me after making this video that the feast days that I had to add were feast days that were not listed in Leviticus 23 as holy convocations. You see, in verse 2, it says, "Ye shall proclaim to be holy convocations, even these are my feasts." Verse 3 goes on to list the Sabbath day as a holy convocation. Then in verse 4, it says, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons." Now, the way I understood this so many years ago is that all of these feast days were holy convocations, but it seems as though I may have been in the minority when it comes to that understanding. Let me show you what I mean. You see there in verse 5 where it's talking about the Passover? It doesn't mention in verse 5 at all that the Passover that falls on the evening of the 14th day is a holy convocation. But the Feast of Unleavened Bread is called a holy convocation, as you see there in verse 7. So this is why I believe that the Jewish community chose to leave the actual date of Passover off of the holy day schedule and only listed the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But if that is correct, then they should have listed this seventh day separately, the same as they did Shemini Ashtoreth, or the great eighth day of the Feast of Tabernacles, because the seventh day of unleavened bread is listed as a holy convocation. But if you remember, the next day that I had to add to the schedule was the Feast of First Fruits, found in verse 10. And you see that it is also absent of the designation as a holy convocation. And again, this is why I believe they left it off, because it is not listed as a holy convocation. When you scroll down, you see that the next day that's actually listed as a holy convocation is down there in verse 21, as it's talking about the Feast of Weeks, or that festival that they refer to as Pentecost or Shavuot. Shavuot has the Holy Convocation marker, and that's why it is listed. Then you look at the fall feasts. If what I'm saying holds true, then Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, as well as Shemini Ashtoreth, will also have the Holy Convocation markers, even though not all of those feasts are mandatory feasts. As you see over here in the book of Exodus, chapter 23, verses 14 through 16, it lists all of the mandatory feasts. here in what's known as the Book of the Covenant. You see unleavened bread, you see the Feast of Harvest or First Fruits, and you see the Feast of Ingathering, which is the Feast of Tabernacles or the Feast of Booths. So back over here looking at Leviticus 23, we see that the Feast of Harvest or Pentecost is listed with a holy convocation marker. But down in verse 24, we see that the memorial of blowing of trumpets has a holy convocation marker, even though it is not a mandatory feast. And down in 27, we see that Atonement Day has the holy convocation marker. It too is not a mandatory feast. And then in verse 35, we see that the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles has a holy convocation marker, and the eighth day has a holy convocation marker. But the way I read in verse 37, all of those days were supposed to have a holy convocation marker. And we were supposed to treat all of them as such, not leaving out the true date of Passover or the date of first fruits. And the other significant change that we had to make to the calendar was changing the date of the Feast of Weeks, because there was translation errors between the Septuagint, which is understood to be a more reliable translation of the Old Testament, and the King James Version of the Old Testament. I guess I say all of that because I want to give these guys the benefit of the doubt. But the more I think about it, the more I realize that the Jewish community has adopted the Catholic doctrine more than the biblical teachings. You have to understand that the Catholics want to substitute the day of Passover with their day of Easter. Is that why the Jewish calendar seems to hide the fact that the Feast of Unleavened Bread is separate from Passover? And then when you think about Shavuot, because on most years, Easter actually falls in the middle of the week of unleavened bread, the Jewish festival of Shavuot would actually be closer to the Catholics' Pentecost. Not to mention that the Jewish community has adopted the Gregorian calendar when it comes to choosing their Sabbath days and forgotten all about the Lord's calendar altogether. So is all of this innocent? Or has the Jewish community been condoners of the changing of the times? Whether they've done it in ignorance or in compliance, you see why now I'm stressing that that was a Jewish calendar and different from the biblical holy days as to be celebrated by the true children of spiritual Israel. And there we have it. We have the calendar all the way out to the year 2096, which by then we should thoroughly understand the process and even have more angelic help to understand what's actually going on. So again, if you guys find anything that you think that I may have done wrong in this video, let's talk about it in the comment section so we can get it corrected for the next video. But as of today, this is the way I believe our holy day calendar should look. So go ahead and write these dates down in your calendar, write them down in your Bibles, write them down in your photo albums, or anywhere you think it'll be a place where you can actually keep up with these dates over the next decades or so. Check back with me just in case I have to do any corrections on it. Look for links to this table in the description of this video. If I do it correctly, you should be able to download and print a copy of it. I hope this helps. Godspeed and shalom.